we were talking about nostalgia and art. Even though you guys haven't been hearing him, he was talking about, for example, um, a person, his own relationship with nostalgia and being very pro nostalgia, and was talking about, for example, the shirt that he's wearing as being from a very special time in terms of memories that he had of being at an international youth camp, a spectacular, as I recall it was you were saying. And I was just thinking, I have this on my shelf behind me, which is a mug that I got when we went to a scout camp when I was 13 in Nauvoo, which was really a meaningful moment for me in terms of connecting to my church history, church heritage, going and experiencing that and kind of feeling the depth of the community building nature of this movement. And so anyway, so in that sense, what we're kind of both, I think, starting with in this conversation is that nostalgia does animate us, but like Art was saying just now, we don't want to get in a place where we're where we're looking back, so much looking back, like the Israelites were doing in that Exodus story, that we forget the issues that were going on in injustices in the past. So actually, we're going to test to see whether we can hear you now, Art. So why don't you go ahead and talk for a second?
Yes. So yes, I think it's funny too, John, that so you mentioned the lifting up the mug. I know when I was doing my daily video blog back earlier on in the pandemic, I had I used a different mug every day, and I've got a whole rack of mugs, and every single one of those is nostalgia for me. All those mugs they're given to me by someone, they were received at an event, they're associated with sacred memories.
Yeah.
So, yes.
So let me just confirm with Leandro. Leandro, are we hearing Art now?
It's all good.
Okay, so now we're all good. So anyway, thanks
Yay.
everybody for bearing with us, and we'll go ahead and continue with the conversation. So anyway, I
Live,
have those mugs too.
live broadcasts are wonderful. But yeah, so mugs are wonderful and nostalgia is wonderful. So I do, I appreciate the chance to just kind of be clear that I wasn't meaning to be disrespectful towards our cherished memories and heritage and legacy. But I think the Exodus scripture just kind of gets at this tension between cherishing our memories of the past, but also being willing to continue to be led by God into God's future of God's justice, which continues to be out in front of us. Because even back in the best days of Community of Christ, when we had those big budgets and full buildings and all of that, we had not yet built Zion, and in any case, that was that context, and we live in a different context now. And so we're engaged in the World Church Leadership Council of Community of Christ this year in a year long, at least a year long, really a focused effort this year. We've been engaged in a discernment process, trying to understand how to respond to the current context that we're in for Community of Christ. And so we've been working with a discernment question all year that is basically saying, God, where does your Holy Spirit lead us next as we embody the soul of Community of Christ and respond to the promptings of that Spirit? So I would certainly, in what I intended to do on Sunday after the service was to make sure that I invited everybody into that discernment question with us. It's a question that the World Church Leadership Council is working on very intentionally, but certainly everybody's invited to think about that and to pray about that, meditate about that, and I think all of us engaging in that searching together can be helpful.
Well, I mean, when you're just talking about that, this idea about when our thoughts about a golden age that we remember, and how wonderful things were working. So I was immediately struck. Roger was also talking about kind of Toronto Congregation's history and his memories of our beautiful sanctuary that we had on Bathurst Street when it was, let's say when it was dedicated, the new part was dedicated in the 1960s. Even if we were even to be able to have that sanctuary and it all back, and actually we were able to be functioning with the kind of programs that they had throughout the week, where they would have been doing plays, they had all the way back to Religios and Zion's League and every other thing that was going on. If we were having that all just completely functioning like a brand new polished machine, of the best time period whenever it ever worked, it wouldn't actually function with it where we are today because of the changed context of the city that we find ourselves in. So that's back in an era before there were all of these other kinds of competing calls to our attention. The fact that we have streaming TV constantly, that that is constantly filling up all of our time. In other words, all of these kinds of things don't exist. So even if we were able to take that thing when it was perfect and try to transpose to present, it would instantly not be able to survive in the current environment because the environment is so different. And so, I mean, I really think, like you say, what is the World Leadership Council in thinking about? Okay, what is God calling us now forward? We're not saying that was wrong, and nothing about what we did back then was wrong. It's rather, how are we called to be a community of Christ in this context, in this environment?
Exactly. And I love the way Roger kind of shared about his vision that he had, and it's, to me, it's I mean, thank goodness for visionaries like Roger, those people that are able to catch a glimpse of some future possibilities, while also honoring the memories and the legacy. And of course, I mean, Toronto has done such a good job of trying uh, to do both those things. So to catch on to the vision that Roger was casting of the future, and then to really engage in an intentional process of discerning how we can move forward into the future while also honoring the legacy of our past. I mean, I think that's the challenge that's before us. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with this. The discernment question in the World Church Leadership Council is very future oriented, but it's also grounded in this profound respect for who we are as community of Christ. So when we talk about embodying the soul of community of Christ, we're not talking about just abandoning who we are. We're talking about being true and authentic to who we are, while at the same time saying how does that soul respond to this context and the future, rather than just trying to get back to the ways that soul responded in the past. And anyway, and I'm looking forward to. I think we've got this question that's going on in the World Church Leadership Council. For Canadians that are out there, I'm excited about us beginning to engage in that conversation in the future. And we're looking, I am imagining a dialogue process and a discernment process that Canadians can start to engage in congregations and campground committees and all sorts of constituent groups across Canada, where we start to engage together in this question of discerning what the Spirit has next for us in Community of Christ in Canada. And so I'm excited about that. We've got this. We plan to share it at the end of the service on Sunday, but we didn't get to. So as we begin to tiptoe into this kind of engaging Canadians in some of these questions and in dialogue and discernment, we've got some questions about nostalgia and about thinking about the future. So we've got a little bit of a survey that I think we're going to be able to share here.
Yeah.
With
So I
folks
think,
today
Parker
too.
and Landra are adding that into the links, and so people will be able to find that in the links to the video, whether you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook. And then we're also going to, for example, republish your sermon all by itself, and that'll be included with the links there. So there'll be a couple
Oh, great.
opportunities for people to find that survey, so that we can just start even really a ball rolling in terms of people's input as we're all kind of inviting, as you're inviting everyone to the table to to get assess where everybody's even coming from. I mean, one of the things that you when as you talked about this as a discernment process, as we are not abandoning what went before, but we're also taking a, let's say, a good look at which portions of that are needed to inform our path ahead. I mean, I'm reminded from the section of the Doctrine and Covenants which talks about honoring your heritage, but not being bound by procedures that don't apply anymore. In other words, that aren't relevant. And we did that, I know, in Toronto when we were going through our discernment process. We had a number of workshops where Saturday after Saturday the whole congregation would get together. We had dialogue groups, and we were discerning on the question, what matters most. And there were so many things that people would throw out, all the things that they said were important about what we did as a congregation, and we can't get rid of that. We couldn't not do that. In other words, that has to be done every week after week, because that's what Doris cares about, the person was. And Doris says, I don't care about that. In other words, so we don't know even
Yeah.
what is the relevant thing, or what was the thing that matters most to each individual, until we actually have the dialogue.
Right. Right. Yeah, and we can learn fascinating things when we actually sit down and spend some time really talking to each other about what matters most. I mean, I know our typical Sunday gatherings, we have the standard set of stuff that we get to say to each other. We check in with each other after church every week,
Yeah.
but a lot of times we don't have those kinds of conversations about really what fundamentally matters most to us as a people, as a congregation. So I love the way, I mean, the way Toronto engaged in that process. And then I love the way you guys brought so many things forward, kind of embodying the soul of the Toronto congregation in different ways and symbolically representing that. I mean, even when I go to the sanctuary there and see the wood slats on the ceiling that remind me of the old Bathurst Street Church. And I know you guys are not saying that, what matters most is to have wood slats
Right.
on the ceiling, but what you are saying is that there's this honoring our legacy while we look into a new future that is really important. And you've represented that in the building in some physical kinds of ways. And I think as we look forward to the future of the church in Canada, I hope we're going to be able to do some of those same things as the church changes and we move into a new era, that we'll be able to bring some things forward with us that symbolize our respect for the past and our legacy, while also making sure that we're being open to God leading us into God's future. Um, so.
Well, I'm excited also about the prospect of, just even, I don't know, being, very open. This is kind of an open-ended discernment process. In other words, being very open to all of the different places that God might lead us. There are all kinds of different ways. I think that people have traditionally experienced community of Christ identity in Canada that are outside even of our traditional 11 o'clock meeting, So I feel like as we're discerning, our identity, our calling, what matters most, there's also, for example, the reunion experience, and how many people and how many of our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who are still connected to Community of Christ identity, let's say through a reunion experience, which they aren't maybe attending in the congregational 11 o'clock. And so that's also, I think, part of this conversation as we are kind of stepping back and looking at this big picture of being Community of Christ, being called to be a Community of Christ in our new context.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's fascinating to think about. So what constitutes the soul of Community of Christ, and how do we embody that? And embodying it means not just it's not just a mental exercise, but it involves some tangible things that we do and we do together. And I certainly think that the heritage of camping and retreats and reunions and family camps is that's got to be a part of what the soul of Community of Christ is about in Canada and other places too. So But we've, as the church changes and as we deal with a different context, we've got questions to figure out how do we embody that moving forward. And there are interesting challenges and questions ahead of us related to that. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I think I'm not launching any formal process today, but I do want to kind of alert Canadians, keep your eyes open, begin to think about, I know you're already thinking, everybody's thinking about these questions about what's happening to the church, what's happening in the context of this world, and where are we going. But I'm imagining soon that we're going to be engaging in a more intentional conversation together across Canada as we really start to say, how are we going to live into the next phase, the next era of being community of Christ in a Canadian context.
So it seems to, I mean, obviously all of the crises that are happening right now are turning everyone's life upside down, and there's been all kinds of individual suffering as with people on the front lines, people being sick, and the other concomitant factors. As I think because of the fact that this is happening right now, it has caused us all to do a big pause and reflect on how we're living our life, because we're not living our life the way we were 8 months ago. In other words, I'm in this apartment more than I would have. I would go outside all the time and didn't have to,
yes.
and put on a mask and think about what I'm doing, and having to. I mean, I generally speaking, because of the elevator situation, 2 or 3 times a week I walk all the way down the 24 flights and walk all the way back up, because it's not encountering people that way, and so that wasn't happening. And so this, I think, is kind of a moment also, though, that it has been open to us for stock taking. So I think that it's also timely that you're bringing this to us right now.
It really is funny when I think about the fact that the World Church Leadership Council, faced with all the changes in the world and the challenges to the church budget and just all the things that were going on already, at the end of 2019, we were gearing up to spend 2020 in this discernment process. And and the idea was, it was a World Church Leadership Council project, but all of a sudden what happened is, because of the pandemic, the entire church, and in some ways the entire world, was prodded into this process, like you say, of taking stock and reevaluating what's important to us and wondering about the future. And so it's been interesting to be engaged in this with the World Church Leadership Council in 2020. It's ended up being, when I say we all need to think about this, I'm not saying anything too radical or crazy. We're all thinking about these kinds of big questions right now because of the pandemic. And in that sense, I think it's been helpful, because it's jostled us a little bit loose from some of our tendency to cling to our nostalgia, to cling to our traditional habits. And I think it's kind of showed us that the church can exist in all sorts of different ways, and can still be meaningful and powerful. We can have powerful experiences together, even sharing communion remotely online. So yeah,
Yeah, there were all sorts of, I mean, just there were all sorts of these providential or prophetic things that are talking about, like, so just the fact that you were planning on doing this discernment. This was the plan already. The World Leadership Council. Likewise, obviously, the fact that we spent the preceding year as a World Church discerning about rules about communion and being able to have communion simultaneously from multiple locations. The same exact thing is true in Toronto congregation, where we actually, our business meeting, the congregation decided last December that this year would be the year that we would focus on Beyond the Walls, that we would focus on integrating our local congregation with the what has become now the worldwide global congregation. And in fact, we didn't even actually, I mean, not only was there no change in terms of the business plan that the congregation had approved in December, but actually we didn't even change the sermon. The sermon roster was already full with all the guests up till May, Anyway, and so in other
It
words,
worked out just
it was
fine.
exactly what it was. So anyway, there were several of these things that came together. I'm just going to ask, just to get confirmed from Parker and Leandro, if they maybe can tell me on the chat that they have maybe shared the links, and so those the survey that you've mentioned has already been able to go out to people. And I also going to ask them if the people who are online have had any questions or who want to address anything to you or ask you anything. If there is such a thing in the comments, because we can't see the comments, but if Parker and Leandro want to share those with us, and so otherwise we'll start wrapping it up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just be, I mean, the questions are just to continue the conversation a little bit more. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about nostalgia and this tension between the nostalgic, well, our nostalgia about the past and looking towards God's future. So I hope people will engage. Take a few minutes to think and to write a few things. That'd be wonderful.
All right. Well, it's been shared. Everything's going good. We don't have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and thank you, Art, for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know that it's like nonstop meetings on Zoom and everything where you're at. And we are very happy to have been able to follow up with you. And thanks again for your ministry this week on Beyond the Walls.
Thanks, John. Thanks to everyone who sent nice words about Sunday too, and thanks to Beyond the Walls. So,
all righty. All right, we're ready. Very good.